So welcome to the first Russian Cinema Research Group seminar of the year. My name is Rachel Morley. I'm the co-chair of the group along with Phil Cavendish, and I'm chairing the event this evening. I just want to start by letting you know quickly about our next event, which is taking place next Monday on the 1st of February, starting at 6 p.m. GMT, as always. So our speaker next week will be Dr. Anna Kovalova, Associate Researcher at the European University of St. Petersburg. Anna's going to be delivering a paper entitled Women of Tomorrow, Female Film Professionals in Pre-Revolutionary Russia, which will talk in particular about Yelizaveta Timan, Russia's first female director, and other female film professionals working in the 1900s and the 1910s in Russia. And I'll add the link for information about that event as well into the chat in case anybody wants.
I've already done that.
Oh, you've done that. Thank you. You're ahead of me, Claudia. Okay, so tonight then. So this seminar tonight continues our discussion of Ilya Khrzhanovsky's DAU project, which we began with our roundtable in December. And a recording of that event is on SSEES YouTube channel as well. So we're continuing to try out sort of slightly new approaches in these seminars to make the most of the online format. So we're deviating a little bit from our usual approach tonight by having two speakers. So our first speaker, Alex Zaishev, will present a paper of around 35 minutes based on his research. And after that, Professor Mark Lipovetsky will offer his response to Alex's ideas and arguments, and also comment on the DAU project as a whole. He's going to speak probably for around 20 minutes. So this should take us up to around 7 o'clock. And after that, we hope to have around half an hour to take questions from you, our audience. So we're aiming to finish at around 7:30. But if you have lots of questions, we might continue a little bit past that. If you would like to ask a question, please indicate this by typing in the chat that you would like to do so. I'll then take the questions in the order that they come in. Up to you whether you want to ask your question yourself. It would be great if you would do that. But if you prefer, you can type the question into the chat and I'll read it out for you. Again, if you'd like to keep your cameras on during the talk, that's fine. But if you prefer to keep it switched off for any reason, that's fine too. Please do, however, keep your microphones on mute while the speakers are presenting. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our two speakers briefly, and then I'll turn the floor over to them. So our first speaker, Alex Zaezjev, is a PhD candidate at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. Alex's doctoral thesis focuses on the role of social media in the development of participatory creative practices. His research focuses primarily on Russia and the post-Soviet region. Alex has given talks on DAU at several conferences, presenting his work both in Europe and North America. And his most recent article was published recently in Baltic Screen Media Review number 8, and that's titled From Dusk Till DAU. I nearly fell into the trap of just saying From Dusk Till Dawn, sorry. From Dusk Till DAU, the rise of heterotopic cinema in the times of pandemic. Combining academic research with creative practice, Alex is also an independent multimedia artist. So Mark Klipovsky, well known to many of you, is professor at the Department of Slavic Languages, Columbia University in the States. Mark is the author of 10 books and editor or co-editor of up to 20 volumes on 20th and 21st century Russian literature and culture. He's best known for his works on Russian postmodernism, New Russian drama, the trickster in Soviet culture, and the writer and artist Dmitry Prigov. Professor Lipovetsky is also one of 4 co-authors of the Oxford History of Russian Literature, published in 2018. He's the winner of the Atsil Award for the Outstanding Contribution to Scholarship, which was awarded in 2014, and also of the Andrei Biely Prize for his input to Russian literature, which was awarded in 2019. Mark is also the co-coordinator, along with Daria Yezerova, of the Russian Film Club at Columbia University and the Harriman Institute, and they also held a really fascinating panel discussion about DAU last year, with speakers Sophie Pinkham, Alexandre Guinness, and Max Lawton. And again, there is a recording of that online, and I'll post the link in the chat if you want to watch that. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Alex now for his paper, which is titled Heterotopia DAU. I don't have it in front of me. How does it go? Heterotopia DAU, Cinema Crisis and Isolated Spaces. Okay, thanks, Alex.
Okay, so I will begin by sharing my screen.
Okay, here you go. So, well, hello everyone. My name is Alexandre, and first of all, I would like to thank the USCL for organizing this seminar and inviting me as well as Professor Lipovetsky to give a talk on DAO. I believe it is important to have a scholarly debate on such a controversial project, which I'm sure will continue to be a topic of heated discussions in the coming years. And since this is the second event organized by the USCL, I will do my best not to repeat topics already discussed in the previous session. At the same time, I will be referring to the speakers that we had in December, so as to sustain a certain continuity of discussion. And a good starting point would be to recall a compilation on DAO published in Apparatus magazine and discussed last time here by its editor, Dr. Drubik Meyer. So here it is. The title of this compilation on DAO was "Sometimes This Space Can Hurt You." And it comes from a speech that Khrzhanovsky gave at the Berlin Biennale last year. Referring to the institute, he said, if you go to this kind of project, of course, it has some kind of liability. Sometimes this space can hurt you. And it seems important to me that he explicitly talks about space here. He didn't say sometimes these ideas can hurt you or sometimes these people can hurt you, which would make more sense because in DAO films we see people hurting each other. Now, he said sometimes this space can hurt you. And I think if you think about it, it's not surprising because every time we talk about DAO, the notion of space emerges in one way or another. For example, the institute built in Kharkov is often referred to as the largest film set in the history of European cinema. Then there are discussions of the 2019 DAO premiere in Paris. Two theaters in the city center were initially supposed to be transformed into a single new immersive space with a giant bridge across the street. Then there is, of course, the ambitious Berlin project that involved the reconstruction of the Berlin Wall. And although it was blocked by the local authorities, we know that it was supposed to be like. Then there are other places connected to DAO, but not featured in the films, like the DAO headquarters in London on Piccadilly Street 100. And for some, all of this is nothing more than a manifestation of a gigantomania. The story of a Russian oligarch, Sergei Adoniev, and his younger protege, Ilya Khrzhanovsky, almost like Richard Wagner and Ludwig II. But I believe there is more to it than simple ego and ambitions. I believe that if we take a closer look at all 15 years of work behind DAO, we'll see how Khrzhanovsky's use of space and spatial sensibility constitutes not only an original, but also a very consistent artistic strategy. And in order to understand this artistic strategy, to understand how Khrzhanovsky manipulates space, I suggest to approach his work using the concept of heterotopia. Heterotopia is a method of spatial reading that was proposed by the French philosopher Michel Foucault in the 60s. And since then, it became quite a popular approach to spatial reading among scholars and cultural critics in various disciplines, including film studies. So let me quickly introduce this concept. The word heterotopia itself is derived from the Greek, and it literally means other place or the place of otherness. And according to Foucault, these are places that physically exist in our world, but which are phenomenologically different from it. What makes them different from the rest of the world, according to Foucault, is that they disrupt the continuity and the regularity of our spatial temporal perception. That is, time and space inside a heterotopia are perceived differently than we perceive them in everyday life. As examples of heterotopias, Foucault cites museums, brothels, cemeteries, prisons, and hospitals, to name just a few. Places that are physically present within our world, but at the same time isolated from it and characterized by unique spatial-temporal perception. As we can see, Foucault applies his method of understanding and describing spatial experience to a wide range of phenomena, from cinemas and museums to prisons and hospitals. So it's not surprising that in the last couple of decades, the concept of heterotopia was introduced as a tool of spatial analysis in various disciplines, including film and media studies. For instance, British cultural historian Annette Kuhn applies this concept in her studies of the cinema in the 30s, and she defines heterotopia as a place that lies outside all places and yet is actually localizable. Another example is Boris Groys, who in a discussion on museums defined it as a place of culturally recognized and codified non-reality. Another prominent film critic and media theorist, Juliana Bruno, extensively uses this concept in her Atlas of Emotions, where she defines heterotopia as a place that is capable of juxtaposing in a single real place segments of diverse geographic worlds and temporal histories. Among other things, what makes heterotopia such an attractive method of spatial analysis is the fact that Foucault formulates the 6 principles of heterotopology. That is, he provides a more or less systematic tool for the application of this model. To demonstrate how the concept of heterotopia applies to DAO, I will analyze the institute using these 6 principles formulated by Foucault. And I call this next section the house that Ilya built. So as we all know, the institute was constructed in Kharkov in 2009, specifically for the filming of DAO, and I believe I don't need to provide an overview of the production process. So I will go on and proceed to the heterotopological analysis of the institute right away. The first principle states that heterotopias are omnipresent, meaning they can be found everywhere in all cultures and areas of human activity, but can take a variety of forms, such as crisis heterotopias and heterotopias of deviation. Heterotopias of deviation, in particular, according to Foucault, are places for individuals whose behavior is deviant in relation to the required norm. The Institute meets this criteria because for almost 3 years it became home for all sorts of deviants, including performance artists like Marina Abramovich, French astrologists and Peruvian shamans, porn actresses and neo-Nazis. And well, the very figure of Lev Landau is a perfect example of a person whose behavior is deviant in relation to the required mean or norm. The second principle states that heterotopias functions are not ontologically predetermined and can be subject to change. In other words, a certain place can become a heterotopia for a certain period of time and then lose this function again. In the case of DAO, we know that the institute was built in 2009. In 2011, the entire film set was destroyed in a ritualized kind of way, followed by a massive open-air party on its ruins. I'm skipping the third principle for now because it is the most important principle for our analysis of DAO, and therefore I will discuss it in details in the end. Now, heterotopias create an absolute break with the everyday time. In other words, within a heterotopia, time is perceived differently when compared to normal life. The fourth principle may, of course, remind us of the Bakhtinian chronotope. However, Bakhtin introduces the chronotope to study fictional time in discourse or in story. Foucault, by contrast, focuses on real places that do physically exist. Only our perception of time is altered when we are in such places. In the case of the Institute, this fourth principle is manifested even better. As we know, the participants of DAO were absorbed in the parallel temporal dimension spanning the years 1938 to 1968, so a pretty extensive stretch of fictional time, which goes against the everyday normal time of the participants. The fifth principle says that access to heterotopia is restricted and requires rites of passage. As Foucault points out, heterotopias always presuppose a system of opening and closing. Either the entry is compulsory, as in the case of entering a barracks or a prison, or else the individual has to partake in some sort of a rite of passage. This fifth principle fully applies to the Institute as well, for we all know how obsessed Khrzhanovsky was with isolating the Institute from the outside world. Rites of passage included signing an NDA agreement, changing one's class to period costumes, as well as leaving behind any personal objects and electronic devices. The sixth principle is a bit more complicated. According to it, heterotopias are physically isolated from, but functionally related to the remaining outside world. Their function is to create a space of illusion that exposes every real space as still more illusionary. So in a way, they function like a magnifying mirror. Think of what Jean Baudrillard wrote about Disneyland. He argued that it exists in order to hide the fact that all of America is a Disneyland. In the case of the Institute, we can think of how this illusionary space that nonetheless existed within our world exposed all its despotic aspects. Now that we see how all these principles of heterotopia apply to the Institute, we can go back and discuss the third principle, because as I've mentioned, Well, it is the most important one for our understanding of heterotopia, but also for our understanding of the original artistic strategy used by Khrzhanovsky. So, according to this third principle, heterotopias juxtapose in a single real place several spaces which may be in themselves incompatible. Foucault further explains how heterotopias conflate private space and public space, cultural space and useful space into a single space of otherness. The language Foucault uses to describe heterotopias, and I quote, just is quite interesting, and I quote, juxtaposed spaces or contradictory sites. It clearly points out to a certain kind of tension that exists between the elements within heterotopia. So according to this third principle, heterotopia is a hybridized space. It oscillates between two contradictory poles, between two contradictory states, such as sacred space or profane space, cultural space or useful space. It is crucial to understand that heterotopia is permanently unstable. It is constantly shifting between the two extremes, and it is never resolved in one way or another. If we apply this third principle to the Institute, we'll clearly see how this place created by Khrzhanovsky oscillates between cinematic fiction and everyday reality without ever choosing one or the other. In DAU, the fictional universe of a motion picture, that is the costumes, the historical setting, the presence of the camera on the set, collides with the mundane reality of the residence of the Institute. Because after a while, for many participants, the Institute was not so much a film set or a fantasy land, but a place of residence and professional activity. And that is precisely what Khrzhanovsky was trying to achieve, to construct a space that would allow for a simultaneous coexistence of both fiction and reality. And it is precisely the construction of the heterotopic space, the Institute, that made it possible to achieve this effect. Now, I would like to visually illustrate this third principle of heterotopia with some graphics that I designed. So the simultaneous coexistence of two contradictory spaces within the Institute recalls the coexistence of two contradictory perspectives in the so-called Necker cube illusion. What you see on the screen is a figure DAU. It is made of the three letters D, A, and U. These three letters can be read in two different ways, depending on your perspective. So here's the first perspective. Oh, sorry. Yeah. And here is the second perspective. The figure itself doesn't change. I'm just making the visualization easier for you to process. So in this image, we can see the paradox of two conflicting perspectives onto a single object. And this paradox remains unresolved because this figure doesn't privilege one orientation over the other, but allows for an oscillating, simultaneous coexistence of both. In Gestalt psychology, this effect is also known as the multistable perception, and it is defined as the spontaneous alternation between two or more perceptual states that occurs when sensory information is ambiguous. The Institute follows a similar multistable logic because the sensory information that this place sends us is just as ambiguous as the picture I'm showing above. Neither the participants nor the production team could say for sure if what they were making was a documentary or a fiction film, a reality show or a period drama, because the heterotopic space of the Institute allowed for a dynamic coexistence of all these contradictory modes, all of the same place. So on the one hand, in DAU, there is the search for verisimilitude. It could be argued that Khrzhanovsky closely follows Zaezjev to minimize the role of performance on screen. His approach to cinematic production recalls what Vertov was describing as жизнь врасплох principle, or life caught unawares. Vertov was famously stressing the fact, and I quote, that all the people must continue to act in front of, and function in front of the camera just as they do in everyday life. And that truth to reality is precisely what Khrzhanovsky wanted to achieve. On the other hand, these same people who were expected to act and function in front of the camera just as they do in everyday life were dressed in period costumes, were immersed in parallel timeline, and most importantly, were placed in a completely surreal pseudo-Stalinist setting. So Khrzhanovsky's method of filmmaking consists of capturing reality, just as Vertov suggested, but a reality that exists outside of the real world. And I mean it not in a figurative way, no, that parallel reality physically existed within the heterotopia, a contradictory space which Foucault described as being simultaneously mythic and real. And it is this hybridized nature of heterotopia that allows Khrzhanovsky to achieve on film a similar effect to the optical illusion of multistable perception that I'm demonstrating now. So the profilmic events that the cameraman Jürgen Jürges was capturing in the Institute were simultaneously a real-life experience and a cinematic fiction. And the fact that the Institute is a pseudo-Stalinist, completely surreal setting that would never have existed in the real Soviet Union is not a production flaw or a historical inaccuracy. It is a way to make fiction intervene with the reality in DAU, and thus to create the effect of a multistable perception. Now, let's compare this approach to conventional filmmaking. A factual film, let's say a documentary or a news serial on TV, documents real human beings and events, all these manifestations of life that take place in real world. Fictional film, let's say a period drama or a narrative film, captures scripted performance and staged events that take place in an imaginary cinematic universe. Now, a film that is produced in heterotopic conditions, such as DAU, combines both perspectives. It documents real life, real human beings, and real events from within an imaginary world. So the method of heterotopic filmmaking, which I believe applies to DAU, consists of making a factual film in a fictional cinematic universe. And it is precisely the hybridized nature of a heterotopia that makes such a filmmaking process possible. At this point, I would like to go back to the apparatus compilation on DAU, which I mentioned in the beginning, and cite one author who intuitively grasped the artistic effect that I'm trying to explain using the model of heterotopic filmmaking. Sorry. In her short and very critical review on DAU, Professor Dennis J. Youngblood writes the following: 1/5 of the way through the 21st century, I see the line between performance and reality, which once seemed easily to define, becoming increasingly blurred to the extent of disappearing. If this is indeed what is happening, it will be a seismic paradigm shift. Now that I've discussed the role of heterotopia in the filmmaking process of DAU, I would like to touch on the role of heterotopic spaces in the reception of DAU. And I will demonstrate how the cinematic content produced within a heterotopia reaches its full potential when it's consumed within another heterotopia. Basically, we'll see why Khrzhanovsky is so obsessed with creating these immersive, isolated spaces for the viewing of his project, may it be in Berlin, in London, or in Paris. I've already explained how the heterotopic filmmaking allowed Khrzhanovsky to simultaneously capture on film two contradictory aspects of DAU, that is of a real-life, almost documentary-like experience, and that of a cinematic fiction, a kind of Soviet period drama. Now, in order to reconcile this disparity, to make two contradictory cinematic planes appear as one, the viewer needs a certain apparatus, a certain tool, just like 3D glasses are necessary for watching a movie that was shot with 3D cameras. So I will be using this analogy of a stereoscope to explain exactly why a heterotopia of reception is necessary to engage with the content that was filmed within a heterotopia of production, such as the Institute. Now, we all know how a stereoscope works. It is an optical device that creates an illusion of a three-dimensional image from a pair of two-dimensional ones. Media theorist Jonathan Crary describes this process as an operation of reconciling disparity, of making two distinct views appear as one. So let's apply this same principle to Khrzhanovsky's project. Now, what you are seeing here is a scheme that I designed to demonstrate how it all works together in the case of DAU. At the point 1, you have DAU as a fiction film, a period drama about Lev Landau. This fictional plane is graphically represented with a grid pattern on the scheme. At the point 2, you have the Institute as a heterotopia of production that began operating in 2009. It constitutes the factual plane of DAU and captures the lived experience of the residents of the Institute. It is represented with a straight line pattern on the image. So heterotopic filmmaking is basically like a stereoscopic camera that simultaneously shoots two views of the same scene. Essentially, it documents both the fictional and the factual planes of the DAU project at the same time. And just like the stereoscopic effect of death is only revealed through stereoscopic glasses, by analogy, fully experiencing the product of heterotopic filmmaking is only possible from within a heterotopia of reception. And what exactly is a heterotopia of reception? Well, it is another contradictory space, another space of otherness that is characterized by all 6 principles of heterotopology that I've covered earlier. Most importantly, it is a space that is characterized by juxtaposition of different spatialities and temporalities. In the case of DAU, of course, we can think of the Parisian premiere, where 2 theaters were transformed into an immersive space. I'm not going to discuss all 6 principles of heterotopology all over again. I'll just quickly point out some important characteristics that make it possible to consider the DAU space in Paris as an example of heterotopia of reception. So first of all, it was isolated from the outside world by the so-called General Consulate of DAU. It issued personal visas. Then accessing Parisian DAU required a rite of passage, and people were searched and questioned at the entrance. Also, multiple juxtaposed contradictory spaces coexisted inside this installation, like, for instance, a stage for a professional orchestra, in other words, a cultural space, was located on the first floor right under a reconstructed version of a typical Soviet apartment, which represented a domestic space. This whole DAU exhibition lasted for a month and was open 24/7, which allowed for a non-stop experience of DAU and provided a complete break with the everyday time. Now, this heterotopia of reception is labeled as point 3 on the scheme. What we see inside this box are 2 cinematic planes, the fictional plane corresponding to the grid pattern and the factual plane corresponding to the dashed pattern. The 2 are reconciled within the heterotopia of reception, which is only possible because it is a place that is itself characterized by a juxtaposition of contradictory spatialities, just as we've seen in the case of the Parisian premiere. So you can see how heterotopic viewing is a reception mode that consists in altering the spatio-temporal conditions of perception for the spectator to be able to tune into the heterotopic media content created within the altered spatio-temporal conditions of production. Now, you might ask, is this really necessary? Can't we just watch it in normal, usual conditions? And the answer is yes, it is possible, but the effect will be like watching a 3D movie without 3D glasses. Technically, a pair of stereoscopic images can be viewed without any special device, and the heterotopic film can also potentially be watched in ordinary non-heterotopic conditions. But in both cases, the image will appear distorted and the illusion of depth will be lost. Now, remember at the beginning I've mentioned that not only does Khrzhanovsky have an artistic strategy, but also that his strategy is very consistent. So we've already covered the process of heterotopic production and heterotopic reception. And now we can take a look at all 15 years of DAU and consider the project in its entirety as an example of heterotopic cinema. So here we see the timeline of the project. I've already explained how the Institute meets all 6 principles described by Foucault and constitutes a heterotopia of production. But that is not all. Khrzhanovsky also created a space of otherness for the post-production of his project. Around 2015, he and his team moved in a Victorian building on 100 Piccadilly in Mayfair, London, transforming it into DAU headquarters. This place was already discussed last time, and even some apparently unauthorized photos were shown. So I will not spend too much time on it. I'll simply mention that it follows all the principles of heterotopology as well. It was isolated from the outside world and guarded by security guards wearing a period uniform. It existed in complete break with the usual time, and likewise it allowed for a coexistence of contradictory spaces inside. So not only the filming of DAU was taking place within the Heterotopia, that is the Institute in Kharkov, but the post-production process as well was taking place in the Heterotopia created in London. Finally, the release of the project was planned to take place in 3 cities, in Berlin, Paris, and London, where Khrzhanovsky was going to construct heterotopias of reception similar to what we've seen in Paris. The Berlin version, for instance, involved a rebuilding of a part of the Berlin Wall with the goal of separating a whole block from the rest of the city. Khrzhanovsky had already secured full support of the federal government and almost succeeded with his ambitious project, but it was called off at the last moment by the local municipal authorities. We don't have much information about the London project, only that the original idea was to open a DAO embassy in Kensington district, the area in London where all the international embassies are located. And even though we don't have a lot of information about the Berlin and the London projects, we can clearly see how they follow this same artistic strategy of creating isolated spaces of otherness. Heterotopic spaces that are meant to disrupt our normal spatial temporal perception, and by doing so, to create the necessary conditions for the reception of content produced within the heterotopia. If we look at the timeline of the project, once again, we'll see that only the very first film, the so-called mother film, doesn't fit this logic of heterotopic cinema. Back in 2006, it was produced as an expensive but rather conventional biopic on Lev Landau. The rest of the project is first and foremost about creating these isolated spaces, spaces of both heterotopic production. Spaces of both heterotopic production, you can now see them underlined on the timeline, as well as spaces of heterotopic reception. I would even go as far as to suggest that the DAO movies themselves probably have less importance for Khrzhanovsky than heterotopic spaces and experience created in the process of filming and screening these movies. In fact, if we adopt this perspective, we can think about Ilya as more of a curator than a filmmaker. After all, that's what he himself claims in one of his interviews. He says, I'm not a film director, I'm the manager of this project. I have absolutely no clue what a film director is today. That also explains the extreme degree of freedom and autonomy that Khrzhanovsky allowed on all stages of production of DAO. We all know that there were no scripts and no consistent story. As Natalia Berezhna explains in the interview, 95% was acting independently and then 5% based on direction from Ilya. The same applies to the post-production process. All of the DAO films released so far were edited by someone else other than Khrzhanovsky himself. We all know that the Natasha film, for instance, was made by Yekaterina Ortel, who was also the makeup artist for the project and also an actress playing the wife of the first director of the institute. Another couple of films, including the infamous Degeneration, were edited by Ilya Permykov, who described the full post-production process in the following way. Ilya would never tell me that he wanted the material to develop in a certain way. This very unusual freedom is one of his principles. He commented intensively the editing process and participated a lot on the post-production stage, but he would never ask me to lose a character, for example. He never imposed his view. And this should not come as a surprise, because as I argue, it is the creation of heterotopic spaces that constitutes Khrzhanovsky's main artistic goal. That is his primary act of creation. And once these spaces are constructed, be it in Kharkov or in London or in Paris or in Berlin, he lets others use them as sandboxes. He delegates it to members of his team as well as to the audience to play with it. And this notion of the sandbox is important here because it demonstrates how the space itself becomes the primary artistic medium for Khrzhanovsky. Space is the material that Ilya is working with. And one last thing I want to point out is the fact that the project that Khrzhanovsky is currently working on, that is the Babin Yar Memorial in Kiev, Ukraine, follows the very same logic as my argument. In case you haven't heard of this project, this time Ilya is not making a movie, this time he is designing a memorial site. And just like in DAO, he works with the phenomenology of a particular place. Once again, he is constructing a heterotopia. Well, we don't know for sure yet if the memorial territory will meet all 6 principles of heterotopology. It will be interesting to apply this model once the work is completed. However, all the sources that are already publicly available definitely suggest that the project will have some heterotopic qualities. But most importantly, in the Babin Yar project, it is the space, once again, that becomes Khrzhanovsky's primary artistic medium. And that concludes my presentation. So you can turn my screen off.
Thanks very much, Alex. So we're going to move directly now to Professor Lipovetsky's response to the paper and then onto your questions. So thank you, Mark, you've got the floor.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event and for the opportunity to speak. here. And of course, thank you, Alexandre, for your paper. It's most exciting, most interesting, although I completely disagree with you. But that doesn't have to reduce its meaning. It's just my disagreement. I completely agree that Khrzhanovsky's DAU is the most original and most ambitious cinematic project of the 21st century, and I don't mean Russian cinema only. And I completely agree with Alexandre's intention to sort of use some new, relatively new, not very new, categories to define the novelty of this project, right? However, I have doubt that Foucault's Heterotopia is a fitting category here. And I won't go into the detail of Alexandre's argument because some of his observations are just brilliant. I'll pretend that I didn't hear them, and we'll try to find weaker spots in his logic. So first of all, I love very much the idea of heterotopic cinema. But I think that it has been existing for quite some time, right? And just thinking about examples, I can list "O Lucky Man" by Lindsay Anderson, or "8.5" by Fellini, or Russian Parade Planet. And we all know that Foucault included into his list of heterotopias, for example, theater, right? So any production about production would be heterotopic, right? Take, for example, the recent TV series Ottipel, which is heterotopic by this criteria because it has production, it has what happens outside of production, etc. We also know multiple examples of films that combine fiction and non-fictional, right? And for example, old film by Attari Seliani, The Pastoral, comes to mind, but many other ideas may happen here, and many other examples can be brought up. Also, there are multiple cultural phenomena that fit this bill, from the very same theme park that Alexandre mentioned. It's a sort of classical heterotopia, right? It's non-real, it's isolated, it combines multiple cultural orders. To, I don't know, Facebook, it is our heterotopia because it also creates this effect of non-reality, and we are having its effects on us, sort of feedback effects as well. So applying the main criteria of heterotopia to DAU brings to less than satisfactory results in my opinion. I sort of, for my own purposes, I simplified a little bit the criteria of heterotopia, and I think that most important are the otherness associated with the isolation. That's one. Coexistence of multiple cultural orders. That's two. And not multiple spaces, multiple cultural orders, right? And the effect of non-reality, or rather new reality, which is basically the aesthetic effect, right? Creation of some kind of the mythological space and mythological drama, so to speak. And if we are looking at multiple cultural orders, yes, indeed, DAU displays multiple cultural orders, right? But how intentional is this, right? These are the constant interaction of anachronisms and supposed historicity, right? Of the intentional invasion of today's celebrities into this space that supposedly locked in time, and this is most puzzling and most interesting effect. But in many ways, it is uncontrolled and uncontrollable, and I think it goes way beyond factual and fictional interaction that Alexandre highlights. Isolation, intended isolation, we all read about rites of passage surrounding these projects. Some probably knows about them better than me, but the scandals surrounding this project, they show how illusory is this isolation, how naive is this invisible wall, of penetratable is this invisible wall separating the institute from today's world, right? This bubble is not protecting anytime or anything, right? And but most important, if this produces a new reality, that's a huge question. That's a huge question, and Alexandre supports and very much sort of advances the central idea of this project. If the right setting will be created, then the life within this setting, the one that Alexandre defines as heterotopic, will be a self-sufficient work of art, basically, right? So that the life itself, the life, so to cut block, right, will become a new product. And I really like the formula that Alexandre coined, the making a factual film in the fictional universe. So I think many directors would subscribe under this formula. But I believe that despite a number of brilliant moments and even brilliant films, the project of DAU as a whole failed exactly in this direction. And let me here read a few paragraphs that I wrote, because otherwise I'll be talking for way too long time. So Khrzhanovsky has been criticized for traumatizing actors with real violence, objectivizing of sexuality and women in particular, orientalizing the Soviet experience, aestheticizing fascism, and creating a facsimile of totalitarianism on the set. Sophie Pinkham, in one of the best critical articles on DAU, summarizes the criticism against DAU in a more balanced way, although I don't quite agree with her overall assessment of the project as the epitome of the new elite cynicism. After all, DAU is a monumental artistic experiment, and the telecom oligarch Sergei Adonyev, whose millions have funded it, deserves a little more respect for spending his money on these experimental films rather than on a new yacht or a football team. Among other things, Pinkham blames Khrzhanovsky for difficulties with interpretation of his film. The films are hard to interpret because it is never clear where artistic intent ends and really begins, she writes. Yet in the modernist context, this is not a problem. Rather, the highest achievement of the artist from the capital A who proves to be able to affect the real. This is exactly where I see the main problem of this project. It is modernist at its core, and its attempt to create a total work of art with all the abusive and totalitarian content of that term resonates with old, i.e. 20th centuries, rather than new 21st centuries elites. In my understanding, the experiment failed because filmmakers invested too much trust in, quotation marks, reality and, quotation marks, authenticity. And because they treated violence, psychological or physical, as the main evidence of authenticity. They hoped that the constructed condition where the actor personages were placed next to actual dangerous people would, with the right push, reproduce the epoch. But the result turned out to be much more limited. There are two types of films among those already released on the DAU site. The first group, the string theory, Nikita Tanya, Valera Sasha, The Empire, Nora Mother, 3 Days, includes films consisting predominantly of conversations between 2, max 3 characters who then do or do not have sex. This apparently should let us in the hero's inner worlds, revealing how their everyday invisibly metamorphoses, how their everyday invisibly metamorphoses them into the zeitgeist. Deprived of scripts, the actors have to improvise their dialogues. With a few notable exceptions, one of them, Valera Sasha, almost complete in obscene type of speech, they fail miserably. As Pinkham correctly writes, quote, the improvised conversations are often numbingly banal and rife with anachronisms. Thus, the dialogues with the characters turn into some undefinable protoplasm, into vata. Even the brilliant, we are told, protagonist DAU Kurenzis is not an exception here. Another group of DAU films invariably represents a repeating formula consisting of three major elements in any given order. A lengthy and chaotic table, bed, street conversation, see above, an animated sexual scene, and brutal violence, psychological or physical, by the KGB officers and their cronies that closely control the characters' intellectual and private lives. See, for example, Natasha, The Brave Man, Katya Tanya, Newman, and of course, the 6-hour-long Degeneration as the epitome of this formula. Among the best examples of this subgenre is the film Brave People, but only because it breaks apart the mechanical opposition of private life, good, and the state-controlled, bad. Here, the torturous, albeit passionate relationship between the Jewish physicist and his wife appear as parallel rather than contrasting to the humiliation and violence he experiences in the office of the KGB boss. But Brave People is an aberration among hours and hours of increasingly predictable routine. Too often, the filmmaker's invasion into the life is not energetic and not inventive enough to turn it into the art, to hit the real to the degree of metaphors and symbols of history. It remains half-cooked at best. One exception, though, the representation of sex. In DAU, this is made into a powerful art that is as expressive as any artistic device could be. For the first time, in my opinion, in Russian cinema, sex is neither pornographic nor repulsive. Here, sexual scenes substitute for incoherent dialogues and clumsy acting. They say more about the characters and their epoch than anything in the films. Unlike almost everything else in DAU, sex is not excessive. The representation of sexuality is one of a few aspects that actually link DAU to the 21st century's aesthetics. Sadly, it's more interesting to talk about these films than to watch them. For me, it is a proof of the experiment's failure. With its determination to create Gesamtkunstwerk, in which the art and reality will be connected by actual violence and ensuing trauma, Khrzhanovsky's films do an homage to the age of modernism, rather than open new ways and test new ideas. Thus, it's necessary to adjust my open statement and say that DAU is one of the most original and most ambitious cinematic projects of the 20th century. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. Alexandre, would you like to respond first before we open the floor to questions?
Yes, sure. I have a couple of things to say that I'm pretty sure will contribute to our discussion. First of all, we often hear people referring to DAU as a Gesamtkunstwerk. And we've seen this in journals, we've seen this in criticism, and Mark just presented the argument for why it is a Gesamtkunstwerk. And I see how it is tempting to see it as a Gesamtkunstwerk. There is this almost a demiurge figure of Khrzhanovsky who creates the whole world, and and it's not by chance that I compared Adoniev and Khrzhanovsky to Wagner and Ludwig II. But at the same time, if we think about what he really created, if we compare, for instance, if we continue this analogy and we compare Khrzhanovsky to Wagner, then we'll see that Wagner was obsessed with control on all stages of his production. That is, he was writing his own librettos. That is absolutely unimaginable for any other opera conductor. He was conducting music, he was conducting his own orchestra, he was writing librettos, and he was also writing music itself. So he was really present, 100% present at all stages of the production of his art. Khrzhanovsky, as I explained, creates a sandbox, and then he lets others inside the sandbox to play within the sandbox, and how they want to use this sandbox, how they want to play with it within this sandbox is completely. I can't hear the noise. I hear some noises. Okay, is of their decision. So, for instance, if they want to have sex, they have sex. If they want to have violence, they will have violence. It's not Khrzhanovsky himself who, well, sometimes we know that in some instances Khrzhanovsky kind of provoked violence or provoked sex, but if we stick with what Natasha Berezhnaya said in the interview, that the 95% was improvisation, 95% was real, and only 5% was coming from Ilya, then we'll see that it doesn't really, in my opinion, doesn't really fit into this logic of total control, just like Wagner was doing in his times. That's number one. Then Mark was completely right about saying that there are a lot of movies and that there are a lot of art forms that can be seen through the heterotopic perspective. Even Facebook, there are articles on the internet that explain how Facebook is a virtual space, a heterotopic space. And it is probably one of the main criticisms that we'll see every time we discuss the notion of heterotopia, because this notion is so vague. It can be actually applied to a variety of phenomena in film studies, also in architecture, in urbanism, in all sorts of disciplines and all sorts of places. So that is absolutely, this criticism is absolutely valid from my point of view. At the same time, we need to have some. I believe that it is one of our best options that we have to discuss the spatial dimension of DAU so far. We can think about spatial theories of Henri Lefebvre, but they are first of all focused on the social construction of space. We can think about the American scholar Edward Soya, and his idea of the third place, but that is also mostly about the social aspect of this space and not a phenomenology of space. I think another scholar that is really could be of use here, and I'm actually writing an article there where I will implicate him into this discussion, is Frederick Jameson in his famous Postmodernism and the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. He dedicated a whole chapter, I think it was the chapter 8, to the discussion of the postmodern space. And he introduces the notion of hyperspace, if I'm not mistaken. And that is something that is quite close to the notion of heterotopia, but probably a little bit more developed and probably less vague. So maybe that can be of use for the analysis of DAU, for future analysis of DAU. Now, Mark also said that there are lots of films that could be considered as examples of heterotopic cinemas, and I think we have to distinguish here between the heterotopias produced on screens, that is the images that we see, and the heterotopias of production, that is the places that were created in order to film, to make a heterotopic movie within those conditions. And if we think about heterotopic cinema in that way, then there are not many examples. I can think about probably Andy Warhol's experiments in cinema. I can most notably think about Watkins' La Commune, which is really close to what Khrzhanovsky was doing. But I can't really think of lots of examples that would really follow this logic of first creating a heterotopic space and then making the movie inside this space. So to reply to this comment. Finally, Mark said that was very critical about the dialogues and the dialogues in the DAU movies and how it is nonsense, how it is vata, and I agree with him. But if we follow my argument, then we will see that it is not the dialogues that are his the primary artistic contribution of DAU movies. It is the space that are created, and if the dialogues that were pronounced within these spaces are not interesting, then well, it might be so. It might be so. It might be not interesting, but that's not the point, because the space is interested. The space is quite unusual and quite original. I think that completes my reply.
Okay, thanks very much. Mark, do you want to pick up on any of that, or should we move to questions from the audience?
I can pick, but it would be better to move to the questions from the audience. I think that we can continue this conversation for a very long time. So we make our statements, and then I think the audience should interfere.
Okay, so
Alexandre, would you agree? Is it okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
so
sure.
we did have a question from Yevgenia Makarova, which I think you've sort of already answered, Alex. It was about whether there are other examples of heterotopic films that you can think of. You did address that.
Yes, well, I just want to, so yes, Richard Watkins, The Punishment Park, and Paris La Commune will be, in my opinion, the two most prominent examples, or maybe the earlier movies of Andy Warhol, where he experimented in his place. But most notably, yes, Richard Watkins' Punishment Park and Paris La Commune would really follow what I'm calling heterotopic filmmaking. That is, the creation of a separated space that lives by its own rules, and then filming the movie, filming making a factual film within this fictional place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's also a question from Irina Shultsky. She's asked me to read it out for you. So what, in your opinion, is the role of power relations in this DAU heterotopic edifice?
Should I go with the answer, or maybe I pass to Mark? Okay.
I think that what I said is the answer to this question, because the role of the artist from the capital A is the manifestation of the power relations here, and Gesamtkunst's work is not necessarily should be exactly like Wagner had it, right? So designed it. And on the other hand, the treatment of violence as the evidence of authenticity is another very important factor in this project. In my reading, but it's Alexandre's time, not mine. I shouldn't respond this question.
Okay, Alexandre, what do you what's your response to that question?
To the question of the relation of power within this space. Well, as I think I also kind of answered the question by saying that this space that it creates is a sandbox, and so on the one hand it has its own rules, it has its boundaries, but then within the sandbox you basically we are free to do whatever we want, and that applies both to the participants of the project. They were almost absolutely free. Well, not absolutely, but let's say like 95% of the time. And that also applies to the audience who were participating in this heterotopias of reception. And we all know, for instance, how in Paris, people were confused because they were not guided. They were not guided in this heterotopic space of reception. They were like, okay, we came to see a movie, but we don't like, there is no movie, there is lots of things going on at the same time. It is all chaotic, it is all very confusing. What should we do? So basically, for instance, if we think about this Parisian experience, then people were asking to be guided, and Khrzhanovsky didn't guide them. Khrzhanovsky just created the heterotopia of reception for them to play within this sandbox, to play, to do whatever they wanted, basically. And I guess that my answer would be the opposite of Marx. That is the authority, that Khrzhanovsky delegates his authority to other members of his team, like Ekaterina Ortel or Ilya Permякov. And I think it is very interesting the fact that Khrzhanovsky didn't produce neither of the films that we are watching at the movie. He was present in the post-production process, of course, but it is not he who decided to make a movie Degeneration, for example. I mean, he let to do the work to Permякov in that particular case. So yeah.
Okay. All right, so we've got several people wanting to ask questions directly. So I'll take them in the order that they've come in the chat. So we have Michał Murawski first, followed by Zhenya Slankin, followed by Phil, followed by Daria. Okay, so Michał, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and thanks, Alexander, for an interesting paper. And I think I kind of agree with Mark that I'm not particularly convinced that the lens of heterotopia is very useful here necessarily. And actually, I think that perhaps DAU is less heterotopic and more heterochronic, in that it's a kind of blast from the past. And this is also what Mark said, and I was talking in the chat about this with Dasha Yezerova too, that it's a kind of blast from the past in this sort of retrogressive, unashamed, high modernist determinism. And that you know, I don't really see the heterotopia here. And I agree that it's a modernist, it's a kind of naive modernist project essentially. But perhaps, and this is perhaps one exception to this is, and this is something that I talked about in my paper in December too, is the architecture and interior design, which are very postmodern in DAU. So they're perhaps the one thing that isn't modernist in the project. So I wonder whether Alexander or Mark had any thoughts about the role that the architecture of the project plays in how they view it. Thanks.
Okay, I will, if Mark would allow, I will jump right away. So you said that it is a blast from the past, but yet at the same time you admit that it is all constructed within a very postmodern setting. And what postmodern architecture is all about is about recapturing the past and then refurbishing the past in a way. So the past is present there, of course, but it is refurbished in a way as to create something absolutely new, some experience that is absolutely new. Because if we consider DAU as an example of as a mix of neoclassicism, constructivism, and expressionism, it is a wild mix that could have never existed in the Soviet Union. It is completely unimaginable, and that's why, like, it is a blast from the past in the sense that yes, these styles were present, all present in the Soviet Union, but at the same time, it's like saying that the architecture by Frank Gehry, for instance, is a blast from the past because he takes so many visual codes of the classical architecture. I also think that it is precisely this surreal, this postmodernist look of the institute, which collides with these, which introduces at this juncture into the attempt of reconstructing this Soviet period. I mean, it's not a simple historical park or the park of the Soviet period, as it was referred by some journalists. I think because if it was a park of the Soviet period, then such architecture wouldn't be possible there. So I think it's not by chance that such an architecture exists there. I mean, that is probably one of the biggest success of DAU project. It is the institute itself. Yes, if Mark wants to.
Just a few words. I was basically very much surprised by and I agree with Alexandre that the architecture of this institute is has been frequently misread as the Stalinist architecture. In fact, it has nothing to do with Stalinism, I guess. Right? It looks more than like brutalist style of the 60s and 70s with certain elements of expressionism, which was, by the way, I disagree with Alexandre that it never could happen in the Soviet Union. It was very typical mixture of styles in the late Soviet Union. I grew up in industrial Ekaterinburg, Sverdlovsk, where this kind of mixture was quite regular. So I think that, and I think it's quite obvious that while trying to design this self-developing universe, Khrzhanovsky was very much critical towards the popular nostalgic attitudes towards the late Soviet period as some kind of golden age, right? So he takes the basically privileged strata of this late Soviet culture, and privileged not in the sense of the relative wealth, but in the sense of intellectual latitude, right? And basically, when you immerse into this, you do feel that there is no golden age. It's anything but golden age, and this impression is, of course, enhanced by the degeneration and Новый Человек, right? These films that sort of forcefully depict the disintegration of this project, right? So for me, this space is, and I'm here answering Nancy's question as well. Heterotopia for me is just one of the types of chronotopes. So for me, chronotop is a broader category than heterotopia, right? And certainly every chronotop doesn't mean space. It means space as the metaphor of time and what's not. Right, and here the same. We have a chronotop, which is a metaphor of the late Soviet modernity, which is sort of intended to collapse. So that's how I read this.
Mm-hmm. Nancy's added another comment, so maybe
I'm arguing with you, Mark. Sorry,
Go
I'm being
ahead,
a disruptor in the midst of it. But it seems to me chronotop and heterotopia indeed could be seen as opposites, antonyms to each other, and in no sense one the extension of the other. A boat is a floating piece of space, a place without a place. It goes from brothel to brothel. Infinity of the sea. All of those are essentially spatial metaphors. Whereas your suggestion that your extension of heterotopia so is to include essentially any narrative line, I think unnecessarily extends its definition. I'm coming in on Alexandre's side, to be honest, and I'll stop there so as not to keep you hostage.
No, that's fine. That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, Alex, respond.
I just want to point out one last thing about the if this kind of architecture could have been possible in the Soviet Union. In the late Soviet Union, yes, in the 70s and the 80s especially, but I'm absolutely sure not in the 30s or in the 40s. That's clearly wouldn't be possible at this period. And we know that the DAU happens between 1938 and 1967. So probably at the very end, yes, but certainly not in 30s, 40s, or 50s. Yeah.
But I'm sorry, Alexandre, first of all, in the architecture, you have the photograph. We can see in this building the echo of constructivism, but do we see the style that we said with mature Stalinism, with high Stalinism? I don't think so. And also, speaking about expressionism, if you go beyond architecture, what about Eisenstein? So did he skip Stalinist period in his cinema? Did he stop being expressionist in his Ivan the Terrible? I strongly doubt that we can sort of imagine that all these styles were completely excluded from the culture of Stalinist period.
Not from the, yes, the argument about the Eisenstein is absolutely on point. But I think the rules of architecture and the regulations in architecture were much more severe. So that's why it echoes the constructivist architecture, but it also echoes neoclassical architecture and expressionist architecture, and it combines it all at the same time. And that's exactly what couldn't have been done in the Soviet Union, from my point of view, at least not in the period of DAU. This mishmash, this collage of architectural styles, that's what I don't see how that could have been possible.
Okay, Zhenya, your turn.
Well, thank you, first of all, both to Alexander and Mark. It's really very interesting to hear both of you. Well, Alexander, first, just a comment is that I found, I will have to think about this idea of heterotopia, but I was quite excited by it because when I was juxtaposing it to my experience in the exhibition in 2019, I thought it was really very kind of obvious encounter with what I experienced, and with even such funny things. I don't know if everybody remembers that they would give out maps of the buildings that were completely absurd, and you could not understand which part was. And it was like body, mind, and something else, and you were supposed to find the spaces. So I think there was really something about losing count of normal everyday time when you went in there. So, well, I will of course read your paper. I'm sorry I didn't read it yet, but I've downloaded it while listening to you, so that's to come. I wanted to discuss one point of your presentation, which is when you quote Khrzhanovsky interview that I also read, when he says that he does not consider himself as a director, and he doesn't know what it means, and And he does give this interview, but almost at the same time, he gives another interview to Lyubov Arkus, with whom he has, I think, long and very, I don't know, close relationship. And what he says to her is completely radically different. He says that he considers the Institute as a original way of rehearsing with actors. So for him, it is a method of rehearsing, putting people in a context when they live in there, and so they are completely infused with their characters, etc. So my question would be, what do you make of this contradictions? Because I must admit, in my paper, I used the second quote to kind of invalidate the one you use. But at the same time, maybe you can do the other way around. But I was curious about that. And then I just wanted to comment a little bit on what Mark was saying. So Mark, first of all, I completely agree with, I think, your idea that it's clearly, I don't know if it's an oeuvre from the 20th century, but I think really he's in such a powerful dialogue with the 20th century, much more than the 21st. I do completely agree with that. And I think it's kind of an argument I try to make in the paper I wrote about it, about the fact that he presents it like post-cinema, but actually it's going backwards and not forward. I'm not sure it's a sign of failure, however. But I do agree with that. The thing I wanted to discuss was when you, well, I could hear how annoyed you were at some of the films from DAU, like it's very systematic. And I do agree that some of the films do show this kind of a little bit weak, maybe narrative structure, but there are several films that are really very different. So what do we make of these films where there is no power in play, and the only power that is played among characters is the intimate violence, like String Theory, like Sasha and Valer? What do we make of these films, of these features? And also, are you sure when you say it's like private life good, power bad, or like Soviet power, or what it represents is bad? I'm not that sure. I think there are a lot of instances where the violence is as much present, and perversion and cruelty in private, and not only in the official space. So that's all from me. Thank you both again, and I'm out.
Thanks. Alex, do you want to go first?
Yes. Okay. So about these two quotes, I know the second quote. I of course read the book chapter by Eugenie. It was really stimulating, really interesting. So to answer this question, I think we have to consider the whole production, both the production and the post-production process. And if we consider, because as I've argued, the post-production process that was happening in London on Piccadilly 100 was also a part of this heterotopic space, the process of heterotopic production. And at this stage, he, as I already discussed, he delegated a lot of his artistic tools to his team. So I think that at this stage, same as in the institute, we see that he is willing to delegate it. He is willing to share his artistic freedom with Ekaterina Ortel or Ilya Permякov or other members of his team. And therefore, from this point of view, he's not a film director. He is a manager, he is a curator, he is probably demiurge if we think of him in the modernist terms. But he's certainly not a film director, because a film director, he will first of all direct his movie, then quite often he will write the script for the movie, and then he will cut the movie. He will make the final cut. Up until now, we didn't see not a single movie was cut by Khrzhanovsky himself. It was always by somebody else. So I think we should. But
sorry, I interrupt you. But are you sure he did not intervene in the editing at all? Even in the end, I mean, you can let an editor do his thing, and then you come in the editing room and work.
I'm referring here to the quote of Ilya Permякov. I don't know how this process really happened. I only can believe what others have said about it. But what Ilya Permякov said is that Ilya didn't intervene in the process. He was supervising it. He was supervising this project. He was commenting on this process. But he, as Permякov says, he didn't ask him to lose a character, for instance. That's what Permякov says. So if Permякov decided to introduce a character, Khrzhanovsky wouldn't come and say, no, I don't want this character here, just cut it out. So I believe that, yes, he was, of course, present. He was, of course, supervising, but it is not his final cut of the movie. And The Degeneration is technically Permyakov's movie and not Khrzhanovsky's, or as an example. So yeah, I think we better stick with the first citation.
Mark, do you want to respond to what Zhenya was saying?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Zhenya, for a question. I mentioned in what I said, Smелые люди, brave people, where the congruence between the private world and the state world is established. In my perception, in the majority of films, this parallelism is sort of subdued, and the contrast is prevailing. But indeed, you're absolutely right. The relations between close people turn out to be increasingly violent, and even when it's seemingly peaceful, it's all about the psychological violence, right? And psychological violence is the main subject in these films as well. And I'm very glad that my dear co-author Birgit Boimers is present here, because I think that we have already answered this question in our book of 2008, which was called Performing Violence, and where we argued that it is the characteristics of the post-Soviet culture, the language, so violence sort of emerged as the language of communication. Right, violence became the universal form of communication. Right, and actually it is a huge question whether this is the effect of heterotopia, whether this is the sort of projection of the post-Soviet understanding, post-Soviet revelations, right, onto the late Soviet epoch, or it is really sort of the excavation of what has been happening there. But it doesn't matter, as a matter of fact, because we are dealing with the art form where the the borderline between times and perspectives is blurred.
Okay, thanks very much. So Phil's question has already basically been answered. It was similar to the question that Eugenie asked. So Daria, over to you, if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. And thanks, Alexander, for the talk. I sort of like to go a little bit away from heterotopia and more into realism, because it seems to me like the argument about realism and sort of unstaged cinema is a big part of your presentation, and to the point that at some point you bring up Vertov and the idea of life caught unawares. And I want to push back against that thought, because you bring up the citations from Khrzhanovsky that he didn't order anyone around or something to that effect, but this is kind of the gospel according to Khrzhanovsky, and intentionality is not necessarily always a productive approach to view films, because we have what he said, but we also have the result. So how do you personally reconcile the this ambition to life caught unawares to verite with the many scenes that are very obviously staged and with very clear authorial control there, with the directorial control?
Okay. First of all, to answer this question, you say many scenes that are clearly staged, and I agree there are some scenes that are clearly staged. But if we, for instance, consider how the time of the scenes, how long do they take? And what percentage of scenes that we've seen in the movies so far are staged? Would it be really such a big percent? I don't think so. Probably 10% of the movies that we've seen so far are clearly staged, probably 15. And then once again, it is not the movies produced by Khrzhanovsky. It is the movies that were made by his teammates, anyway, by the production team. So we can't really. I think we can't really say that it is Khrzhanovsky who wanted these particular scenes to be present on the screen. While in the Institute, he clearly had certain ideas of what might look good on the screen, and therefore he kind of staged some situations, I believe, like we know with this situation with the pig, for instance, in the Generation, or in other movies. We know about it, but first of all, it doesn't make a substantial part of the movies that we've seen so far, and the second of all, these scenes were chosen for in the post-production by other people and not Khrzhanovsky himself. So that my question is a bit ambiguous, because I don't have a lot of information about the production process. Honestly, we have to rely on what was said by the actors, by the participants. And by Khrzhanovsky himself, but what I'm seeing on the screen is probably 10% that is staged, and 90% is quite real and quite in the style of cinema verite or verisimilitude or Ziga Vertov and all this stuff. That would be my answer.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
No, go on. I was inviting you.
I was just going to say that I very much don't agree with that. But just kind of a quick comment. I don't think that the editing choice undermines stageness, so kind of the duration of each subsequent shot or scene. I don't think it kind of undermines the staged character of that. And then kind of one of my thoughts about it was Mark brought up the sex scenes in DAU, which is something that we already discussed in the past, but I disagree that they look natural, especially because I talked about those scenes with both Mark and Sophie Pinkham at length. The way that they're produced are pornographic in the method that they're shot, not in the content itself. They have the camera angles, the positioning, I don't know, the fact that most actors don't seem to have pubic hair. That is very clearly meant to look like a pornographic film. And that kind of, in just that selection alone, suggests stagedness. And that's just one example of what I see in DAO as going at odds with all of the claims of how unstaged and verite is. But everyone's entitled to an opinion.
I'm just going to abuse my position as chair to ask a question of just factual question and on the issue about whether scripts were used or not during the filming, because I think it's Robert Bird in his piece in Kino Cultura does mention that there were scripts on sale in Paris. I don't.
Yes, yes, they were.
Who's that? Genia speaking.
Yes, sorry.
So, have you seen the script, Genia? And do they?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't look like, well, they're, sorry, I'm turning on my camera back. They don't really look like proper scripts, and they could be really like written after film, like novelization rather.
Transcription of what?
Yes, but yeah. So, but I am, well, sorry, since I'm talking, but I do agree with Dasha. I think that much more of what we see is staged than what he would say, because that was the kind of the publicity of the project, is that everything is authentic. But really, when you watch the films closely, you can see a lot of things that tend to show us that a lot of it is staged, or at least talked about beforehand, so the operator kind of knows what's going to happen, etc. I think.
Yeah.
May I comment on the scripts? Oh.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. So if I understand correctly, and if we are talking about the same thing that was on sale in Paris, then it's not the scripts per se, because it is the retranscription of what was said in the movies afterwards. So okay. It's like, so it's not like a script is something that is written and then pronounced afterwards. And here it's vice versa. And as far as I understand, Khrzhanovsky now has an ambition of retranscribing all the lines that were said in the all 700 hours of DAO, and then publish it as 200 something books, and to receive a Nobel Prize in literature for it. I don't know if it's a joke that he made or it's his real ambitions, but it seems real. Like if we consider the size of this project, that might be one of his real ambitions, of course. And I would also like to comment on this, on what Eugenie written in the comments section, that sometimes some directors didn't have the final cut, and that doesn't make them less of directors of their films. It is absolutely true. But if we think about DAO, the final cut of the DAO would be DAO digital. And that was what Khrzhanovsky said on multiple occasions, that wait until all 700 hours of film is there, wait until this digital platform is there, and that will be the final cut. Because what we are seeing now is like teasers or trailers for the project. And I don't want to be the advocate of the devil. It seems like I'm defending his position in some way. I'm just trying to give this information, for consideration.
Okay, thank you. There's several comments from people as well in the chat on the same topic, but we'll move on. I think, Natasha, you have a question or a comment? Are you there?
Here I am.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much for this presentation. Let me start with the end, where we saw this bloodshot topography of Babin Yar. And that's, as you mentioned, Khrzhanovsky's new project, or his current project. And I think this is like something which really inspired me to think about that, and to think about your idea of heterotopia. I totally agree. One shouldn't see, my opinion perhaps, that one shouldn't see him as a film director, and one should also not consider the films, whether they're made by Permyakov or like directed by Permyakov or by himself, as full-fledged film works. rather, I would kind of like see them as, if we follow your thought about a heterotopic space, see them as in that paradigm you mentioned. I think that's very useful, which is cemetery, brothel, museum, whatever we can continue, prison, right? So, and this is where we are. It's like, it is a sharashka, it is like a closed set, it's a cemetery, and a cemetery is always like, I would say, very interesting form of remembering the past, but being made up out of the bodies of the past. So it's, you know, the prach and yeah, the dust and the bones and everything. And this is what we see also on that last image. And that's like what his maybe new, you know, his new task is, and what he thinks his new task is, to build a memorial where you can't actually build a memorial because it's somehow impossible to do that. So for me, this is like interesting insight. And I was actually even thinking that what you said about the factual and the fictional. And thank you for quoting Denise Youngblood. I think this is exactly what Nancy also mentioned. It is like, it's both. It's the heterotopia and the chronotopos. They all meet in the cemetery. But what's interesting about Babin Yar is that it's like a concealed cemetery, and he wants to somehow show it. He wants to bring it out. So this is a similar project to DAU, as, you know, kind of like bringing out this past and bringing out the zombies, bringing out the skeletons or whatever is left. So this is, I think the metaphor really works for me. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Alex, do you want to respond to that, or?
I mean, well, thank you for, thank you for first of all for editing this edition of Apparatus, where some authors provided very good insights into DAO, in my opinion, and that led my thought into the direction of this spatial reading in some way. But also, I believe that we often discuss the films by other directors in certain retrospective. We think of what, for instance, Tarkovsky did, and we consider all of the movies that he did at the time, and then we kind of try to we are trying to find a certain approach to his movies that would allow us to explain what he was really doing. And I believe with Khrzhanovsky, we have to do the same thing. We have to grant him the fact that he was involved in one project for 15 years, and there is a certain consistency within this project, and this consistency also follows afterwards in Babin Yar, and this consistency and it is precisely his desire to work with space, to work with spatial experience, and it's not by chance that I evoked the notion of phenomenology. I think it's really important here, and there is actually, I wanted actually to include a whole section on the phenomenology of film studies. There is a great book by Vivian Sobchak that is of the same name, The Phenomenology of the Film Studies, that was really useful for my paper. Fortunately, I didn't have time to expand on this, on her ideas, but that notion of a multisensory corporal experience of a movie or of a space is very important here. And I think that echoes what Eugenie was saying about the experience in Paris.
Okay, so it's nearly 20 to 8. Does anyone have any more questions? There are no more in the chat. Anyone want to make any more comments? No? Okay, so I guess we'll end there. So just to say thank you again, Alexandre, very much for your paper, which provoked a really interesting discussion. So thank you to Mark in particular for accepting our invitation to respond, which did come rather late. So thank you for accepting that at short notice. And thank you to everyone in the audience for great questions. The recording will probably be up later this week. I'm not sure exactly when, but if you just search for SSEES YouTube, you should find it if you want to watch it again. And hope to see many of you for next week for Anna Kovalova's talk on pre-revolutionary film, from one end to the other. Okay, thanks very much.
I just want to say that I'm very grateful for the UCL once again, and for Mark for accepting the invitation, and for all the people that came to see this presentation and to engage in the discussion. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, all friends, for coming here. It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.